the real issue was there. But then I called the team. I called, okay, that we all together being into it. Then we'll discuss what is the problems. The first part time that I told the team, okay, now open up your course right now to the whoever into the that being this group, and we all have to share the course. Then tell me what is the problem. So we found out a lot more issues as a part of it. Okay, I thought of two things. Whether I change the course right now, the application being developed, whether I want to change the course or I'll do some infrastructural changes to do it. It was a tough time. It was a tough time for me to decide whether what to do actually. We spent whole 13th night, 14th night, 15th night, two action items. What are the open source products we can use to scale it right now? Then what are the changes we have to develop to modify the course? We opened up the course. We opened up the course to the people around. I think AWS team was there. I think great. I think they are being there, and my team was there, and the Trigen team who was developing the coding. They were there. So we all mixed together on that day. I think 3 nights we spent, and we launched the I think on 16th in the way that okay, not that launch happened. My second example will be on 2015, April 9th, I got a call from the Secretary IT, R.S. Sharma. Okay, why not? What do you know about DigiLocker? I say, I don't know anything about DigiLocker. But he told me that, okay, this application to be launched by Digital India program, July 15th, I think at the time. So he told me, you have to build it from the scratch, and the time is very less, so you have to do it. The time and factor and application, if you look at that point, I thought that how to do it. I don't have any developer with me. I had some experience of Dropbox or Google Drive, what the features they are bringing, and I have my product, what I say that it's a own cloud that time. So I thought that, okay, if I take own cloud, then I can be into it and I can change something. So the product can be launched by July 15th, the deadline. Even if I say that I've taken the own cloud, then who will my developers to develop? I don't have a developer. So some way I promised that, okay, that will happen to the ministry. Then I called some developers voluntarily. I think they are my old friends and old colleagues. I called them, okay, this is the things we have to do. And can we do it? Around 6 developers joined with me and with my team and the NEGD. So we developed the things, taking the own cloud code and put a repository and modify the codes. And that in the government way that you have to integrate Aadhaar and other things to that open source code. So we did it as a part of, but it's not that as a part of something I say that that the great 2 examples why I am talking about, because it is open source, we have the code, we modify the codes and we collaborate each other, then we launch the things. So the 2 lines, the 2 timelines as a part of the whole things give you the example of the power of open source. If you are open as a part of government or a private, you are open to that sharing of the code, you are putting the code into the repository and you are ready to open to any programmer who is being the part of the system, you are being that, then I think you can cover the timeline, the challenges, you can cover it up as a part of what is the required. So open source products give you that opportunity, and I think that open source code if you are open to collaboration with whether I always say that we have to collaborate as a part of team in the inside government or outside government, then I think we can do the wonder for the country. I think that during the pandemic, I think I am after 2 years, I'm doing the first conference here. I think I'm into 5 projects in between. I think these are all massive scale projects. What are we doing? CoWIN is a massive scale project. If you look at the volume of the CoWIN, It is around 1.2 billion hits per day. It's happening for the last few months from and the current scenario, if you look at that, our client base or we say the citizen base registered in the application is now stands the 45 crores in the last 5 months. And we say that, okay, now where will be a land of another 5 months, most probably we may end up at around 80 crores. The scale of COVID and the scale of DigiLocker having also that same way, if you look at that 7 crore user base and the repository having around 45 crores digital documents. Then my third application, what we did in between the pandemic, it is called the Poson Tracker, where we say that 12 lakhs Anganwadi workers are working, and the repository having around 11 crores beneficiaries registered as a part of taking the benefits. Then another part is I say that we built something called the National Academic Depository in between as a part of new application, and Academic Bank of Credit as the new applications. The successful part of this, the 5 important projects of the country, we say that we being as a team to be open to collaborate with others and to use of open source as a part of our product architecture. That didn't give us that, okay, now we have to buy something. We are creating the designing the product based upon something. So we are open to do it. So as a part of the whole, the people that the teammates of mine or the CTOs are who are being into it actually. If you look at that, if we build the COVID in the timeline as a part of last few months, as a part, as well as another 5 products in between in the pandemic time, because we overcome the challenge, because we use open source, we use as a part of something we call as a part of repository. When I say that, why we're talking about repository this time, because every time we're talking about something called, we use open source, but as a part of government, I always miss that point from anybody from my colleagues or from my counterparts, because they don't say that, okay, we are using the standard practices, we are open to the code sharing, we are using the version control, we are being ready to innovate the things. Then more important part is what is the government is missing. That is called the strategic control. I always say what we miss actually, because we are not using most of the government departments, ministries, they say, okay, we are using open source. But I always say it does not mean that you are being actually using that open source development methodology. You are not approaching. You say I am using MariaDB, or you say you are using something called Postgres. That does not mean that you are using open source as a product. It is only one part of the story. But if you say that, how much I say that what you are being developed, can you put it in a repository? Do you have a strategic control? Do you have a collaboration methodology? Can you open up your the codes to the public, or can you open it to the code to the even as a part of industries also? If I say why that we are lacking, if you say that now Kobean is open to the other nations as a part, you take our codes. Now the lots of private companies are very much interested to take our code and going forward to implement it. If you look at that perspective of industry participation in the government, and they take the course, they modify the course, they implement into other countries, I think that will be a much more benefits as a part of India. I am looking at that perspective, because somebody told me, I think way back somebody, हमारा कोड चोरी करके ले जाएगा and other जगह में implement करता. That as a part of India, I always say that we are taking more codes into our own part, but we are not sharing to that others to take out our libraries, plugins, and other things. That is why that I always prospect to the government part I'm talking about. Yes, I think if you look at the COVID, if you look at that DigiLocker success, or what the products we are being built as a part of from NEGD, actually, if you look at that, one is definitely we are looking at, we save the cost, we build the standardizations, we are being into open to work with anybody. So that is why that I expect that the participants to be into that mode, rather than we say that we are using open source product, rather than we say that we should be in a practice of developing the application in the actual how the open source being is products being developed across the world. what actually the transform, that whole 5 things or 6 and others are doing the same thing in the open source practices as a part of the COVID or DigiLocker. What is the transformation actually we did? Because we are having a pure control mechanism of source code management, like we Git, version control, release management. Then we are using lots of plugins or some things as a part of the things. Also, we opened as a part of to the our team, our that collaboration between the different teams. So that's why that success of COVID, success of other processes happened, and success. Why that I'm always talking about the COVID, because it happens in the country where that we open up the course to our partners, our other people to look at and guide us as a part of, because it's a massive scale of the application that as a success into this product. That's why we always say that why not we open up the course and let's others see and let's give us the way forward as a part. I still having one lady, I think that I think on that day of 15th night, that day I am missing that, I think so, that AWS girl actually, she came around night 2 p.m. Sorry, 2 a.m. and looked at our code, say, okay, that is these are the problems you are doing right now in your queries. So we modify the query, that then we work some way. So that's why I say that the problem solving is much more easier when you talk about opening the codes. And that's why that I always say that why that government people, most of them, we say that I think are you using Git or personal control? No, we don't use as a part of it, because somebody will look at our codes in the repository. So that is why that the mindset of the developers, even if say that in the governments, they take their whole laptops with their own codes, but they don't put that whole code back to a repository to be that. They say that, okay, I am pushing my codes, my application, not to a repository. I am giving another example of how that we saved in between one issue. I still remember one of my iOS developer, he joined and I have been giving him a critical work to do. Critical work means it is the next 2 days that application needs to be rolled out. I asked him, okay, where is your code? He told me that, okay, that code is in the laptop. I said, why that you didn't push your codes to the repository? He thought sometimes, okay, nobody told me to do it. Okay, I told him, okay, right now it's 5 o'clock. When you have to go back to your home, you just push the codes to the repository, then go. I think that day he pushed the codes. The next day, the particular that iOS developer came to me that on the way that laptop being stolen from the marketplace. So just look at this criticality as a part of, as a developer, as a team lead or a director, whatever you just see, just that criticality of that particular incident. To me, it is the critical incident, purely critical incident that app needs to be launched in the next 2 days. But that person's being told by me on that same day and the laptop being stolen. So that is why that we always say that you as a person or as a developer, you have to use something. I always say that why that when people are being into millions are using GitHubs, we are still not following the best practices what inside the government not doing it. So that is why that one is the strategic control. That second part is, yes, code needs to be pushed to the repository, whether it's the GitHub, whether it's the open source. It is immaterial. It's material. That part is, yes, as a government strategic control, you have to be into your codes in a repository. So that is basic standard practice. I expect from this whole conversation as a this conference, at least people should use Git repository, and at least they should have to look at that the strategic control of the source codes, so that industry and others should look at their part. Then coming back to the another perspective of the open source product, actually that I always looked at something in the government. They buy some licensing software. After some time, they say, okay, no, we require more license. Then I generally say, why that you require a license as a part? Okay, now that my database is too large, that my queries are being not running. They say lots of explanation. They require their database needs to be scaled up, and they want to spend some crores of money onto the database. what they generally that practices these people generally do, that I found that okay, that they generally do as a part of, they buy a costly licensing software, and they will put the logs, because the security people told them that you have to keep the logs. So what they generally do, they keep the logs, and logs are 90% and actual data is 10%. So that's why that whole cost of the projects are more, because they don't see what are the free. Even if I say they have built the product in the that particular licensing product, they don't see they can do the things community based, something called software or database. They can use that, and they can keep their logs in the community databases like MariaDB, MySQL, or Postgres, or anything that way. So the people don't do that. People don't look at that other side of the whole world, how they are coming up. So if you coming to back to again the DigiLocker and coming back to the projects, we are being almost more than billions of data with us, more than billions. But still, we have not bought any licensing product. Still, we don't buy any software. We are still into the open source, community based. Even no support having taken from the open source products what we are using right now. If you look at that same scale that you want to build, and you are spending most probably how much money of licensing softwares will cost, I think that will come to some billions. But if you look at that other side of the CoWIN, then DigiLocker, then our academic repository, we use all community-based softwares. The products are, I am now telling what are the products we are using as a part of product. It is all not hardware-based load balancer. We use very community product that is called HA proxy, Envoy proxy. That are the community product you use for the load balancings. When you say that people generally struggles in that architectural point of view, they generally that do the practice of development into a licensing software, or also that part. So they don't do something called very simple caching as a part of their database. So they generally go into large size, large number of license, and they want to scale, and they want to every time read or write to the database. So they don't find something called a Redis as a very small software is available to do a beautiful, wonderful work for them. But they don't look at that side. So that's why that I always say that please look at the other side. What are the other things? Even if you say you are using a licensing software, but you use the same small things in the what the people of open source being built, you use that to scale your application, rather than you think about just to buy more hardwares. That will solve the problem. That will not solve the problem. Rather than you see smartly what are the other ways around in the market and freely available just to do a innovation, and you can scale the application for the billions. So that is why that people are lacking as a part of, I always say that is why that another lack of things is happening, because people are not looking at open source markets, what are the products available, and they can use it as a part of something. So generally they looked at something architecturally. I always feel that, okay, people say, okay, they have used a database, Postgres or MariaDB, and they develop the application. They say that their problem is over. Now they want to go for the more hardwares to scale it. So rather than they have to look at the other software components, they can add on to their product design or development, so that they can scale to a large number of people as a part of scaling their applications. So three problems I'm talking about here. One is open source EU way of development approach. Then second is the open source product use. Third part is, my point is, yes, for scaling, don't go for something you require a large number of hardwares, but you see the another open source product, how you want to scale your architecture as a part. Then another interesting thing happening in the governments right now is, yes, we are talking about the clouds, but when the people are going to the cloud, they are asking for something called, okay, that I require something the same size of the virtual machines on the cloud, so that they resemble their hardware versus that VMs. So they require something called, okay, that big size of the VMs. So they want to scale. I think that is where that another point of view of mine always comes to when I give the advice to that even if you by the bigger VMs, it will also not solve the problem of yours. So that's why that you have to look at that architectural perspective of what you want to build and what are the best practices in the open source is happening. So open source practices gives you lots of things as a part of scaling your applications. Like a very simple thing, government people missing that the whole application they build, but they will not put a simple CDN onto top of their applications. It's very common sense as a part of why not put a CDN as a part of role application architecture. Then there is another scale that they fail because they don't use how to cache the database storage into a caching database. So these are the problems inside the governments. One is we are not open up to our codes. We are not open up as a part. They see that okay, they see it in a different way. I think I always have that same question will come to me again. Whether this open source is actually secure. So that is the mostly they will ask you that part, whether this open source database is actually scalable. So they come out this type of part as a part of their questions. But I give you that today's example that what we are right now. And if you ask me any Facebook, Twitter, Google, anybody, if they say they have used any licensing software, nobody uses licensing software as a part. Again back to the COVID versus government approach to ours as a part of this. COVID is a successful. Why that we say that part? Definitely the first point is COVID is a successful. COVID is handling the lots of loads. COVID is handling the things because from the day one we make our source code open to our counter partners. Look at our code, say where is our problem. We use Git, version control, CI/CD pipelines to our applications. Then also we are very much open for any ideas from others. Yesterday, I think my security guy, some security party, you asked me, okay, now you require to remove, you just remove the SSL pinning and you remove the something called Google SafeNet. I say you take the codes and do whatever you want to do. Just look at my codes. Rather than I say you do a black box testing rather than you do a white box testing also. So that is nothing wrong as a part of, but what we are lacking as a government side is we are not using open source, Git, version control, release management, no CI/CD pipelines. We are not open to give our codes to anybody to something we say that, okay, wo hamara code le jayega. So that is why that I always feel that if the success of COVID is maybe another use case, because another use case of the COVID is we never met anybody as a part of in my room or my chairman or my that person or that we start with the 5% to right now is a 50 members team. We never met together. We are being into develop the whole application of that scale without anything, without any get together, without any physical office space. And I think the developers I generally connect that they are the rural part of the India. That is the biggest, best part of the whole story being that hiring we did in between. All of them are from the small towns. So that is why the greatest learning point of the whole application part, I say always for the last few months, if we develop the COVID without a physical office, we cross that boundary actually. We don't require an office altogether. That is the same way I always say that we build the DigiLocker, taking some few people from the Jharkhand, and that DigiLocker we built. Now that I never met for the last 5 years my team, and everybody is working from the different places. Why you require offices altogether? Then another third point of mine is collaboration of what actually happening as in our perspective, how the NGD we are trying to do. Look at the interns actually. If your source code is open or you are ready to use the source code or Git, GitLab or GitHub as a part of a development, you can hire 100 of interns to your program. Actually, most of the government department generally miss that point of whole things. Last 2 weeks, actually, I think last week I talked to my testing head. He told me that, okay, he has hired around 45 or 48 interns to for the testing. If you look at the way of 45 interns to a application for a internship program to look at our application, we are finding the greatest people at the best brain from the college. Okay, do the interns with us as a part of the year. So that is why that another advantage to the whole government to look that into it as a part of. If you open up something, you don't even if you say you are afraid of to go in a public, rather than you say okay, now you are using a repository and ask any intern or something to participate as a part of government to help you out. They are ready to help you out. They can do something great wonders to write a plugin or modules or something, the small task they can do for you. And also the testing part also. So that is why that another advantage, just to look that perspective also. It's not your developers, it also the others interns are, they are ready to, yeah. I think in India, I think some interns are paying for them, paying that to get internship from the private companies. You just open up your team leads to okay, ask for the interns. I think people are ready to come and join as interns. So that is why that I am being focused as a part of the inside our organization, as well as I want that the same can be taken as a part of internship in the government software development practices. If the only small things you want to do, again and again I am speaking to that same word, Git version control release management. If you do that, then your whole world is open as a team lead or as a CTO or a yeah. So that is one that I am expecting as a part of that learning processes to do it. Uh, yeah. I think we have to do lots of things as a part of government. At least I say that even if we are talking about GitHub way of making your code public, at least I say that you come to the open force, have an account, and at least register yourself. And whatever you require from our side, whether you require to get training or something, I think I have organized around 18 training programs across the states. Yeah. So we are ready to help you how to the practices we are adopting in the NEGD that can translate to the other organizations. The way we are developing that will definitely will help you out in that. Thank you. To all of you, I think it's a great, it's my pleasure. I am here again after 2 years. So any questions and answers I will take. I think I'm ready to take it.
Thank you so much for the information. And it is really important for people to know the importance of open source and how to use it, more importantly. Maybe we know at a basic level. If anybody has any questions, please ask. Otherwise, after the next session, we will have the Q&A with the experts and we can take the questions there. Meantime, you can also mention your questions in the chat section also. So we'll move to our next expert. We would like to welcome Mr. Martin Woodward. He is Senior Director of Developer Relations, GitHub. A brief introduction about Mr. Martin. Before, he was Executive Director of .NET Foundation, helping drive Microsoft's move towards open source, and was a principal group program manager of the team building tooling for DevOps team inside and outside the company, where there he was recognized by Business Insider as one of the top executives in software development at Microsoft. Welcome, Mr. Martin. Dheeraj, can we have Mr. Martin? So, Mr. Martin would be joining in another 5-10 minutes. So, meantime, if anybody has any questions, we are open to take the questions.
Hello, Ruchi.
Yes.
I think your chat is disabled and you're asking for the questions on the chat.
Okay, sir, we'll enable the chat. Anyways, you can ask the questions also.
It's enable. It's enable.
Now it is enabled. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ruchi.
So, I see Mr. Reggie Kumar. He has raised his hand. Mr. Reggie, do you have any question to ask?
Good morning, madam. Can I have my query?
Yes, sir, please.
Madam, sir, this is regarding a issue with respect to COVID, whether you will be able to answer the question or I'll have to make the question for the later session.
No, you answer it. You just put your question. I will answer.
Sir, so whenever there is a technical glitch with respect to COVID application, is there a state nodal officer appointed to rectify the issue, or we have to route all our queries to the national helpline?
Technical glitch means what?
So, because many times, many of our beneficiaries, they have come, because I'm working in health sector, I'm facing this issue. My beneficiaries, they are coming and they are claiming that they have taken both doses of vaccination, but still the COVID portal shows that they are partially vaccinated. That means their second dose is not either updated or first dose is updated on two different IDs. This keeps on happening. Whether we have any option, because we already have a raise an issue option, but that's not functioning many times.
It is not a technical issue. One is the operational issues. I think in the COVID it happened between in some private sectors they have not entered their data to the systems.
Yes.
Then some people take the systems in a different right. What in the COVID scenario is happening, they do dose one in the both in the two different mobiles. Then the third option, third thing is happened in between as a part of yeah. Sometimes they do generally the name by the operators are the wrong data entry. What we technically are doing it as a part of, okay, we are matching their names and other things in a data. Yeah. If you look at the figure, actually, it's a staggering figure. We have resolved the issue. I think till last week, actually, 40 lakhs issues we have been resolved. And some thousands issues are still pending with us, only thousands issues. We are giving it to the district immunization officer to resolve it. It's like some South Indian names. The data entry is being MB Nayak, and now somewhere you are being into the Nayak MB. So in the software way that if you look at the we are also adding some filtering as a part of doing some auto way of correction. I think this is the mostly look at the digital data part. We still, I think, looked at improving our filtering part to match this type of issues as a part of auto correction, but some part definitely will have to go to the district immunization. We are now setting up that also.
Okay, sir. So is there any other number or option other than getting logged in the COVID portal? They can raise an issue offline. They can raise an issue to any other number.
So that we are trying to establish as a part of UNDP. I think they have to establish a call center. Yes, so that is not happened, but still as a technology team, we are now solving in a different way.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Anyone has any other question, please feel free to ask. We still have time for Mr. Martin to join.
I'm actually here already as well, by the way. Good morning.
Yeah, welcome, Mr. Martin. Yeah, so do you have a presentation to share?
I do, yeah. Would you like me to start sharing?
Yeah, please. We were waiting for you.
Certainly. Am I okay to start?
Yes.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining. And a good afternoon to you. And it's great to speak to you. Thanks for having me. So my name is Martin Woodward. Martin Woodward at github.com, at Martin Woodward on Twitter and on social media if you want to get hold of me. What I wanted to do today was kind of talk a bit about some of experiences I've had kind of working in the open. I've done this with various different projects and various different large enterprises, as well as worked with government agencies and things on their open source strategies and different approaches and things. And so this is going to be very much of a business look at open source and why it makes sense. So, you know, when it makes sense in business, how it works into a business strategy and all that sort of stuff. Less about the how to contribute to open source, but more at a business point of view, less on the technical side. So hopefully that's what you're wanting to see. And without further ado, we'll get started. Some background to me, have a history doing this. I was actually been involved in, say, quite a few projects that have done this along the way. So you've probably already done this a few times already, but you know, we talk about what is open source, but based on some of the discussions earlier on today and during the day today, I thought it'd be quickly good to talk a little bit about code visibility, and because there's a spectrum of sharing that you can do as organizations and between each other. And open source is at one end of the spectrum and private's at the other end of the spectrum. And so kind of just wanted to go over that spectrum so that we're very clear what that spectrum is and then where open source sits on it. At the very far end, you have private. And, you know, that's where it's just a component that a developer's experimenting with. Only they have access to it. Not too useful because only they can use it, but they can build software, they can still deliver software, but only they have access to it. The next level of visibility up to that is team shared. And this is typically when people think of version control inside of an organization historically, this is typically where they're at in their heads and where you probably got most experience from if you haven't been doing open source development. And that's where you have a team of people who have read and commit access to a project, so that you have rewrite access to some source control. And there you're working as a team together, collaborating on software, building software together. And that's by a large degree where, you know, traditionally a lot of development has happened over the past, say, 20, 30 years, is in team shared components and things. The next level up from that is what we tend to call inner source. And that's where we're using sort of techniques and tooling from the open source community, but on that collaboration style, but we're doing that inside of a larger organization or group. So that's where you're taking code and you have a small group of people who have write access to that code, but a larger group of people who have read access to that code, not the public internet, not everybody in the world, usually inside of an organization. But you use the ability to do pull requests, you use the ability of all sorts of open source style collaboration to contribute on that code and to share that code amongst your organization. But you keep a very limited team of people with write access and a larger team of people with read access within the organization. So, you know, inside the firewall, you can think of it as. Next level up from that would be a partner shared source mechanism. And this is quite common in intra-government agencies and things. So anything in this code base is being shared across legal entity boundaries. Sometimes that's, say you're working on source code with a technology provider, you want to have a shared code base that you can both work in. Maybe you've got multiple departments, multiple agencies working on a shared code base. That would be where you're in like a partner shared source mechanism. The reason why that's slightly above inner source is because you have these intercompany boundaries in there and like legal entity boundaries in there. And that means that IP is being transferred and IP is being moved around this organization. And so that's where you kind of, need to be thinking about the flow of IP and make sure you have the appropriate mechanisms in place. And we'll talk about it with an open source in a moment as well. Next up, you have public, where source code is published publicly. But if it's not under a license, then it's not actually open source. Once it's under a license that allows and encourages sharing, that's when it becomes open source. So just making something public doesn't necessarily make it open source. And actually inside of GitHub, we differentiate between code that's been shared publicly and code that's been shared under an open source license that allows sharing. So when I talk about open source, and when we as a community talk about open source, we're often meaning like three things together at the same time. We're meaning the kind of the legal concept, the ability to use copyright to attach permissions and give permissions to people of what they do with a particular license to that code. And so we talk about the license of open source, and the sharing of things. We're going to cover a bit of that. That's an incredibly dry topic. So we're going to get through it and we're going to cover it because it's important you know it. But we're going to spend some time on the funner stuff as well, which is open source software. So, shared components that you're consuming quite often, that you're assembling your solutions together using shared software, and then maybe you're contributing back to as well. And then finally, and Eric has spoken about this earlier on, but the community is also an incredibly vital part of open source. And again, when people talk about open source, they tend to be thinking about either the license, the software, or the community. But actually, open source is all of these things coming together. And so we're going to tackle all of those areas in this session today. So let's talk about open source first of all, and we'll cover the dry stuff first, and then we can get into the nitty gritty of things. So if we talk about what an open source license is, it's basically the ability to share code under a license, and it allows the person who's consuming the code, who has the code, to change and distribute that software. That's kind of fundamental into all the open source licenses. And in fact, the open source definition from the OSI actually explicitly states that, the license must not discriminate against people, fields of endeavor, against this product, or restricts software in other ways. So a license that's academic use only, for example, isn't an open source license in the strict sense. Yes, that code could be public. Yes, that code could be available for inspection and peer review, but it's not an open source license. Open source allows people to change the software and allows people to build a community around that software component where they can get value from it and they can contribute back to it. And that's important to differentiate that public is not open. There is a difference. When we look at a typical open source license, and this is an MIT license, which is the one that I would encourage people to default to if you're not sure of a license. It's one of the most permissive open source licenses out there, and also one of the most compatible. So if you're after breadth of distribution, if you're after the ability for your component you're distributing to be used in commercial software as well as other open source libraries, then MIT license is a perfectly good default choice. So it says, the license typically says what type of license it is, makes it easily identifiable. We use that to identify licenses programmatically, and we actually, then help people identify, and different people use the license, name and things to actually help determine what a licensed software is and help you figure out what your liabilities are and what you need to do. And the next, it tends to give like a who owns the copyright of this code. the way that open source licenses are enforced are through copyright laws in all geographies. And so that's how kind of the license is being enforced, is by saying, hey, I have the copyright to this. However, I'm giving you some permissions. I give you the permission to do this. And an example of the MIT licenses, you can do whatever you want with it, basically. I give you the permission to do whatever you want. However, the obligations I'm attaching down here is you must keep the license with this source code. You can't just take this code and then get rid of the license from it. And you must, that basically gives attribution as well, typically, so if you're using this code, you've got to say in the code where that code's coming from, which is a fairly low kind of bar in terms of what obligations you have. Different licenses put on greater obligations, as we're going to talk about in a second. And then finally, the license also states what warranties are provided. In the case of MIT, no warranties are provided. You can use this software, you can do with it what you want, but don't sue me, is kind of what the license is saying. And so that's what it is in legal terms. Again, fairly readable, fairly easy to understand, and that's kind of what it is. And the MIT license is also well proven, and among the Apache licenses and other licenses we'll talk about are very well known, well proven, been through court cases in different regions and things, and have stood up to the tests of the courts. So then if we talk about the different flavors of open source that we have in terms of licensing, because as I talk about as an organization dealing with open source, you need to be aware roughly of the different categories of license and then obligations that come with them. So on the far left side, we have kind of what we call the attribution licenses. So that's things like Apache, BSD, MIT. These licenses are, very basic, very straightforward. They allow any kind of downstream use, so any kind of use by you as a consumer of that open source, including use in commercial products and things like that, as long as you have attribution, usually is what you need. There is a CC0 public domain type licenses as well that don't even require attribution, but the vast majority, are completely permissive, just require a bit of attribution, which is fine. On the far right-hand side of this, you have what we call the copyleft licenses. You might have heard these used by the term like viral licenses and things. We'll explain why, but copyleft is a nicer term and a better term. It's things like GPL v2, GPL v3, AGPL. And these are licenses that say if you redistribute the covered program, if you redistribute that covered code, then you must pass along the same rights that you received in the whole program that this is included in. So that's not just for the modifications you make to that source code, that's the entire program. It's sort of work based on the program, and kind of some of the vagueness in that is a bit of a key there. We basically assume that it's everything that's linked into that code, anything that's kind of assembled using that code as a core part of it, then it needs to be licensed under that very, very same license, i.e. GPL. So you can't take, if you had some code that was GPL, you couldn't include that in another open source project that was MIT licensed. You can't go that way, because what it's saying is that the code has to be all under the one license kind of thing, and distributed under those terms. Now, the importance and why I I differentiated between partner shared source and say inner source is that with the copyleft licenses and a lot of these kind of the more restrictive licenses, a lot of the obligations, they kick in typically when you redistribute. Some of them, like AGPL, are actually kick in earlier in the process. But with things like GPL, LGPL, GPL v2, the obligations, i.e. making your source code available, they kick in when you redistribute. What does redistribution mean is a great question, but it is typically understood by most sort of lawyers you'll go talk to mean kind of distribution outside of your legal entity, typically the organization. So when you're doing partner shared source and things like that, then that includes redistribution usually by most agreements. Also, giving that software to your citizens, distributing the software, in an application to your citizens is an example of where, again, redistribution. And then in the middle, we have these downstream or kind of weak copyleft licenses. They've generally worded LGPL sort of V2 is an interesting example, but they're kind of generally worded in a way that they have some obligations, but they typically apply very explicitly to the component itself and not to the whole thing that you've built with that component. So if I give you a very practical example, when we build software that includes GPL v2 licensed open source, we must make that source code available to everybody. And in fact, the license goes as far to say you must make it available to people, if they ask you for it, kind of thing. And so we even have a team of people and a PO box where people can write to and they can request a copy of the source code. We will take that source code, we will burn it onto a DVD and we will mail it to them. Like in the license terms, it's fairly explicit about kind of how you have to make the code available to people, and just making it available online might not be enough. And so we make it available in lots of ways. And so it has some fairly broad obligations that type of license comes with, where something like MIT doesn't. And that very much makes you as an organization change how you approach different bits of open source and different, and how you license things. So if we think about working with open source, it's kind of three different areas where where you think about this and where you kind of think about your obligations and what you need to do. The first one is when you're bringing IP in, when you're consuming open source. When you're consuming that open source, when you're bringing that IP in, you need to be thinking about what open source is, what licenses it is. You need to think about those open source dependencies, and we're going to talk about that. The second one is when you're contributing open source, when you're contributing to a project. And that's where you're giving IP out of your organization, where IP is leaving your organization. And that, again, depending on the license of things that you're contributing to, might have certain implications, might have patent, you might be granting patent access rights, you might be granting other things. So you want to think of it as IP going out of the organization, IP coming in, and then IP going out. And then finally, the third one is when you redistribute, when you take the open source that you've consumed, you've combined it with your own IP, with your own code, and then you're redistributing that open source. You're sharing that component. Typically, you're relicensing some of the IP because you might have taken some MIT code, combined it with your own code, and say be releasing it under a commercial license, or be releasing under a different license. So you're typically relicensing and things, but that's where you're redistributing it, where you're giving it to your consumers, the people who are using your thing. And that's a redistribution of open source. So that's the point there. So if you build an application for your citizens to use, and you then take the application and make it available to them via the internet, or even, in walk-in centers where they'll go use your software maybe, then that's typically, you want to think about that as you're actually redistributing that code, that open source. So first of all, let's talk about consuming in. Do you use open source? Do you consume open source? The answer is probably yes, to be honest. The vast majority of organizations, when we look, 99% of organizations now make extensive use of open source. And then of those organizations, depending on the organization and the sector, it's between about 80 and 90% of the code that they're distributing, the code that they're sending out, actually is built of open source. with a very small component being the component they've built themselves. So you think about that component a lot because that was the one that took you lots of work, and you saw the effort for it. But actually, when you examine all of the code that you're shipping, usually the vast majority of the code that you're shipping is actually code that you've brought in from open source nowadays. That's a massive change in the past 10 years. And again, it depends on the organizations. And there's two things here. If you're in an organization that isn't allowed to consume open source, you have a blanket policy that says we're not consuming open source. Understand that this is the way that most of the rest of the world is now building software. And so if you're not doing that, which, some of the largest IT companies in the world weren't 10 years ago, then you're missing out. You're not fighting on an equal footing. But actually, if you go examine your code base, you'll probably see your developers are actually looking at open source libraries, are looking at things like Stack Overflow for solutions and bringing that code in, and are relicensing that IP anyway, even though you probably got policies that tell them not to. And you'll find that that's happening. And vast majority of organizations are shipping open source software. So now that you're admitting you're shipping open source software and you've got to deal with it, how do you build policies? How do you build infrastructure in place that kind of takes that into account? And the key thing as somebody who runs IT businesses and things, the key thing for me is to treat open source acquisitions, open source libraries that we're taking a dependency on, treat them like other technology dependencies. So, what's the license? Examine it. How does that affect how we're going to ship things? If I've got two components, one's MIT, one's GPL, and this is the first time I'm introducing GPL and I don't have mechanisms in place for handling that, then I need to go build those and go figure out how to handle those processes inside of my organization. How well used, how well tested is this project? What's the community like around that project? Is it active? Is it something where there's lots of people getting involved, or is it kind of a dying community where there isn't much innovation and improvement? Again, even if it's just static and there isn't anything happening in that community, doesn't mean you don't want to take a dependency on it. You just got to understand that that's the case and that's going to be what's happening with this particular project. And then the other thing you want to also think about is, if you are taking a critical dependency on an open source dependency, one that you might want to help with the direction of and help contribute to, can you become a part of that community? Is that community going to be welcoming to you, or are they going to reject you? Are they going to not want your changes? And again, that's something you want to consider, especially when you're taking very, very, very critical open source dependencies. The next level is make sure you're able to comply with the licensing terms. Remember, if you want people to respect your license, you need to respect theirs. You do not get the ability to not respect people's licensing terms. And in fact, as sort of leaders inside of the government and things, you're often held to a higher standard in terms of license compliance than, say, a startup of a couple of people working out of a basement might be, sort of thing. So make sure that you're able to comply with those licensing terms, typically attribution, but also maybe in terms of source redistribution and source access, that sort of thing. And then finally, remember, you are responsible for shipping all the code that you ship. You're responsible for supporting all the code that you ship, to your customers, whether that's departments, whether that's areas inside of the government, or whether that's actually, citizens or whatever. You're responsible for the code you ship. So you can't say, this component I have over here, I've taken a dependency on it, it's got a critical security vulnerability. Sorry, it's not my fault. You don't get that permission. You're the one that's providing this software, this service to your consumers, the users of your software and service. And so you're responsible for supporting all of that code. So you need to know exactly what it is you're shipping. You need to make sure that code's up to your government standards, and you need to be able to fix bugs in that code. So if there is defects and it happens to be within the open source library, you want to make sure you're able to fix those. And you also, it's considered bad form to kind of be blaming publicly this open source dependency. You're taking responsibility for it by shipping it. In your license, probably you're kind of indemnifying people as well. So, you're the one that owns the software that you ship. And that's very important when we come to look at security, because we're seeing increasingly, supply chain attacks and things being an attack vector of getting vulnerabilities into people's projects. And you got to remember as well, it's not just the top tier of things you take in a dependency on. Say you take a dependency on, a typical node library or a typical NPM library, that might also pull in 4 or 5 or 100 different other libraries that it's taking dependencies on. And so you get these chains of dependencies that you need to keep up to date with. You need to keep up to date with security vulnerabilities, all that sort of thing. And you actually want to do that as early as you can in the software development process, because if you wait until the point where you've had data breaches, they're not only very embarrassing and can be quite career ending, especially for some of the ministers and things. You want to have it done as earlier in the process as possible to minimize the costs of fixing that. And so that's why, we invest heavily, and the industry in general is investing heavily in securing that whole development cycle, helping make sure the supply chain's improved, helping bringing code scanning tools into place, and helping making sure you're not accidentally checking in secrets into your source code, all that sort of thing. And regardless of what tooling you use, regardless of who you get this tooling from, you need to be thinking about how are we protecting our software supply chain? What are we doing to look for unknown vulnerabilities in our own code? And then what are we doing to make sure we're not accidentally distributing secrets and sharing secrets in our code bases, especially as we're contributing and building source code in the open, because it makes, it makes that source code easier to inspect. And it also, with secrets especially, definitely makes that code easy to inspect. Okay. I don't want to frighten you with all that stuff though, but why now we talked about IP coming in, and it makes sense. Like, we want to consume, we want to build, we want to stand on the shoulders of giants and have rapid time to market, deliver solutions to our citizens as quickly as possible. How can we then contribute code? Like, why do we want to contribute code, in fact? And the important thing to think about with thinking about contribution is, what is the business need? Why, as a business, are we wanting to contribute? So, we talk about some of the reasons why, not particularly great reasons for thinking about contribution, but what is the business need? Why are you contributing? Typically, for a typical, you're consuming an open source library and you want to fix some issues with it. Let's look at the kind of how open source contribution works. You have an upstream project and your fork, your copy of that project. When you begin coding, you take a copy of that code and then you build from here, and that's what you develop, because you need to be able to fix things in the future. If something goes wrong, you need to be able to fix it. So typically you've got a copy, maybe if you've got some urgent changes you want to make, you make them into your copy of the code, your fork is what we call it in open source terms. And then you send a request, a contribution comes in the form of a pull request that goes to that upstream project that says, hey, I've made this change to my thing to fix a bug, to make it work in a certain way. I would like you, upstream project, to include this in your code, please. Please pull this change from my public repo into your public repo. Why do that? What's the incentive, especially with something like this MIT license, where you're not being told you have to. With GPL, you're told you have to give back the code. With MIT, you don't have to give back the code. It's just, you just have to attribute it and things. So why bother? And as a business, the usual reason why you want to do that is because if you're consuming a library and then you've got your own copy of the library here, if you can think about it in terms of branching, especially if you're, the longer a branch lives, then the further you diverge from it and the harder it is to stay in sync. With an open source project, it's just the same between forks. If you are in your own copy of that project, the longer you live in that copy, then the harder it is to pull changes down from this upstream project. And if the whole point of using this upstream project was so you could benefit from functionality and security fixes and everything else that's being delivered into this project, the longer you live in this copy without sending your changes back, the harder it is for you to be able to pull those changes from the upstream library, because every time you pull those changes, you might have some conflicts with your copy. You might have to remake those fixes you made earlier. You might have to remake them to this version you've pulled down. And it gets more and more complicated over time. And so typically as an organization, what we try and do is contribute the changes back to the upstream library as quickly as possible, do the negotiation, pay the integration debt, then the pain of merging this code into the upstream library, so that then in the future, we can take down that code. We know it includes our changes, but we also know it includes code fixes and things that we want to do and the latest features and the latest security updates. But if you aren't ever going to pull back from that upstream library and this code is permissively licensed, do you need to contribute those changes back? You don't have to. And so look at the business reasons, like look at why you're doing that. But usually, and in the vast majority of cases, you want to set up your organization so that it's easy for your developers to contribute small bug fixes back into the upstream libraries, so that you diverge, so you don't diverge as much from these upstream things. And a lot of organizations have set their IP policies and set their guidance around these things, so that anyone basically in the organization can publish a fix upstream under, as long as that fix is under a known set of licenses like MIT, Apache, that sort of thing. And they can get automatic approval from their manager and from their organization to do that. Some organizations you have to ask. Other organizations, it's actually given blanket approval as long as it's a small fix, because they know that there's no IP in there. They know the risk of giving patents, giving access to IP is very, very low with bug fixes and things. So it's worth the risk of just letting people send those bug fixes and those code changes back. So, let's talk now about kind of contributions and why people get involved in open source, and that'll lead to sharing your thing as an open source component itself. So open source communities, they used to, as a maintainer of an open source project, you're used to people coming at you with ideas and coming at you with suggestions. Talk is cheap, okay? That's not how you influence me, and that's not how you influence an open source community. The way that you influence an open source community is by contributing code. These open source communities value the code contributions over everything else. Code is what talks, because code is the lifeblood, is the future of that project. So if you as an organization, and even when you start to look at, India as the country, if you want to have influence in the direction of open source projects and make sure they're going in the direction that you need them to be going in, then you want to be an active contributor to that project. So you're not only pushing your bug fixes back, but you're also involved in the community now, and you're taking an active role, because only as an active member of that community can you have your voice heard and can you influence the future direction of this project. And this is particularly critical with, ones you're taking a critical dependency on. If we take a look at what I like to call the contribution funnel, and this helps you understand a lot about the dynamics of both inner source and open source style collaboration inside of organizations. If you take a typical software library that's shared, the vast majority of people will come and they will just consume that thing. 99% of people just consume it. They might try it, they might use it, they might fail, they might succeed, and they never tell you. They just try, they go, and they never come back. They just consume. You never hear from them. And that's perfectly acceptable. That's how it works. This is good. Only a small percentage of those will contribute something back, will contribute time. And the important thing to remember as somebody who's maintaining or somebody who's running an open source library or a shared source library is that only people who have consumed, who have got value from consuming this library and this component, are going to contribute. So the people who will contribute are a subset of the people who are consuming, and that's important to remember. So now the people who are contributing time have to be consuming. So what do you do to maximize the number of people giving you some time? Well, you maximize the number of people who are consuming. So you make it easy to consume. You make it available to the widest group of people. You give it the ability to, to get easy to get started. You give it, certain licenses. You show it the, give screenshots and things. You give good onboarding guidance, and you mark that sort of stuff. So you need to maximize the number of people consuming so that you can maximize the number of people coming through and giving you back some time. And then of the people who give you some time, the vast majority of those will maybe log an issue, log a bug. They'll maybe fix some documentation issues for you. But a small percentage of the people who give you time will actually contribute some code that's useful to you. Oh, wow, that's a feature I really wanted, or that's a bug fix I really needed that our community needed. That's always going to be a subset of the people who've given you some time. So again, how do you maximize the number of people coming through? Well, you want to make sure that when people do give you some time, you're responsive to them, you're welcoming to them. You want to make sure you make it easy for them to contribute code and having helpful contributions coming in. You want to make sure it's super easy for them to get quick feedback, all that sort of stuff. And then finally, maintaining that source code base, controlling the direction of this open source project, all that sort of thing. You only get to do that. You only get to be an owner of that project and co-maintainer of that project if you've been contributing time, if you've been contributing code over the long run, and then only a small percentage of those people contributing code will come to the point where they're co-maintaining. And it's up to the current maintainer, how many people, what sort of size of community you want as a maintainer. Some people want lots of people, some people don't want anybody else. And it's important to be clear about that and set expectations around that. But you only have people come and be maintainer once they've contributed code and had a good experience of contributing code. So again, you want to maximize the number of people coming through, and you want to give them a sense of co-ownership of that project if you then want to get them to a point where they'll be an owner. So how do we have helpful contributions? How do we kind of, help that happen? The first thing is, I'm sorry, folks, you have to have actual documentation, like open source and shared source and all that sort of stuff. You end up needing more documentation than less, because often it's an asynchronous workflow. You can't rely on people being in the same office anymore. And so you need to have discoverable, projects. You need them well documented. You need good governance on that project. So you need, what the code of conduct is, what the expectations are of being a part of this community. But you also need to have a test suite that passes. You want to have CI and CD set up. So, continuous integration builds and things set up on your project, because, there's nothing worse than downloading a software library, wanting to make a change, and you'll run the code locally, and it doesn't work because there's been some fix there that wasn't in the version you were using, and all sorts of horrificness. And so you can't even get started because the code you've downloaded is already broke. And that happens, when you don't have CI, when you don't have tests in place, all that sort of stuff. So you tend to want to have those things. And the final thing is, you want to be very collaborative. You want to be open to contribution, and you want to kind of think in small reusable components. So the way that we do is that we describe the project's intent in the README. We explain the contribution process. We say what our expectations are around external contributions, if we want them or if we don't. As long as you set expectations, that's good. And we also, and we'll come to this towards the end, we make sure that people who want to be part of this community, that you as a project are also part of this community, and you don't have special permissions that you don't exercise in the day-to-day maintenance of the software. We'll come back to that later. We maintain a query of kind of first contributions that are easy. We try and have kind of a service level agreement. We try and be responsive to some of these issues where we want contributions. And we're also trying to keep the code clean, keep it approachable, all that sort of thing. So why, as an organization, should you build in the open? Why do you talk about open source at all? And you need to think about how open source software fits into and how contribution fits into the strategy of your organizations and your businesses and what you're doing today. So when I look at open source contribution, it tends to fit into one of these three categories, okay? And good and valid reasons for kind of contributing and sharing and working in the open. The first one is around collaboration. So for a lot of like software that we build and a lot of things that we're doing, it's very hard to get feedback on them until it's built, delivered, shipping, and running in people's hands. By working in the open and by building in the open, especially for small components and especially for architectural deliverables or for things where you're trying to set standards, all those sorts of things, you're trying to agree standards between bodies, either interstate, between states, or governmentally at the federal level, or internationally as well. You're able to have those conversations in the open and be much more agile because people can see the thing that you're working on. They don't have to wait for the end deliverable. They can be focusing on the thing they're working on and give you feedback on exactly where you are right now. And so there's a lot of reasons, if you look at things like the .NET framework or the Go language or, Java, for example, all these types of things, by being in the open, they're able to be much more agile as a thing that they wouldn't be able to get iteration and feedback loops on until much later in the software process if they weren't in the open. And so that's why we see the push for, especially like lots of low-level components and stuff, to be open source so that they are much more agile, much more iterative, much more open and contribute to. And that's also why we tend to see standards and things moving towards open source as well. Then if we look at another reason is, being able to influence direction, having people contribute on the direction your project's going in, having people like kind of have early collaboration, that sort of thing. The next level of valid strategy is around distribution. So, you want to access a massively broad user base. You want to access the largest base possible. You want to hit the most people possible with this thing. Releasing under an open source license gives you that, because not only can this thing go to all of the software inside of the government, it can also go to all of the software being used by businesses in India. It can be used by both open source and by proprietary software as well. So if the thing that you're building, maybe it's an access to a centralized gateway where you're submitting things, that sort of thing, like that wants to be have the broadest base possible to achieve your business goals. Therefore, open source for a distribution point makes sense. There's also some argument, especially around government open source, is around making this available, making the data available, especially with a lot of open data stuff, to the citizens who own that data in effect, and also the people who are paying for development of that software. There's arguments around that side as well. And then finally, the one that makes sense with open source contribution is with compatibility. So taking your open source and making it work with existing open source communities and markets. If you're trying to work with, say, the Linux community, if you're trying to influence the direction of Kubernetes and containers and those sorts of things, if you want to have compatibility with those existing open source markets and ecosystems, then it makes sense for you also to be open source and to be contributing. Now, I also, when I'm having chats with people, I hear some really, really sketchy kind of business goals. And I just wanted to highlight these because these three things are very commonly mentioned. And in my experience, are not business reasons that will have sustainable open source contribution from your organization. These are things that I'm about to cover that do happen. They are benefits of open source, but they're not the business case. They're not why you're doing it. They don't justify it. The first one is around PR. People, you hear quite often, oh, we'll do this, we'll get some good press, it'll be great. Yes, you will get good press. Yes, people will be happy, but that press cycle will be very, very short-lived, will last you a day or two at most, maybe a week. and it'll not last forever. And it doesn't justify the long-term investment, because building software is expensive, building IP is expensive. It doesn't justify that long-term investment doing the open just from the PR hit alone. You need to have a business reason why doing it in the open makes more sense and will help you achieve your business goals better than not doing it in the open. Another thing is people think they're going to get free work. They're going to get the community just magically sending in contributions. Yes, you do get contributions coming in, but that free work doesn't happen without a tax. You, as a maintainer of that organization, need to invest in that community for them to give you contributions of IP and to give you contributions of work. But also you need to review those contributions. You need to merge them into your code base. Otherwise, you're not going to be the central place where these contributions come back to. So you will get some free work. You will get amazing contributions that come from all around your community, but you will only do that if you're investing in that project. And you as a business can only afford to invest in that project if you have a long-term business goal around that project, which makes sense by being open. So the free work alone doesn't pay for it usually. And then finally is around recruitment. Hey, we'll do this because it's easier to recruit. Yes, we do find organizations that have a strong open source presence. It is much easier to recruit people into that organization because they're aware of them. They like the work that they do. They're able to see what we're doing. We do see that happen. But again, if you can't pay for those developers, if you can't pay for those engineers because you've got a sustainable business case that involves being open, then helping with recruitment doesn't matter. You need a business reason why you're working on the open. And the important thing to remember about being in the open is, frequently competitors, both nation state competitors, but also, business competitors and things like that, we work together on open source libraries because we understand what our business goals are, and we understand that working together on this open source library isn't a zero-sum game. Two companies can work on a project together and they're both delivering value to their customers and competing on how quickly they deliver value and how quickly they can innovate and things like that, how good their customer support is and things. But the core thing that they're sharing isn't part of their core business, isn't part of their business differentiation. And so by building it together, they're able to build quicker, they're able to have a solution that meets everybody's needs better, they're able to collaborate better. And so quite often, the best case for building open source is when your business goal, you will understand them well, and then you understand who, and how you can collaborate with people. And the fact that collaboration, you build a network effect around yourself, and that collaboration makes you stronger, accelerates your progress, doesn't weaken the progress that you make. The next thing is around, going open and what that actually feels like, and the typical processes that we see people do. We see people, first of all, typically make their source code available, and that has, certain level of impact. Then you might get sort of a point where you have open specifications. You might have the point where you have open kind of design notes, RFCs, that sort of thing. So what you're doing is now starting to move your process into the open. And again, you get feedback. You're starting to get things done there. And the next one is we've seen people do where they get to the point where the source is open. It's available in an open source license, but it's kind of, you're working on a private fork of that code, but you may be publishing this available. You may be publishing it to GitHub or a different open source library, wherever, different Forge. And you're doing that. Again, you get some level of contribution, but to get the business value, to get the business benefits of open source, we consistently see that doesn't happen until you take this giant leap of actually being part of the community yourself. And as an organization, adopting the same community workflow that you want contributors to your library to contribute. Only at that point do you start to get the free work, do you start to get contributions coming in, do you start to build a community and start to build a network effect. If the community sees that there's you with special access and they can, yes, submit some stuff in, but really they're not part of the community, they're not going to fully buy into your project until you go work with them, you go work on the same repository and the same repos that they do. If you want to make a change to your own code base, you do that via a pull request that you review in the open, that they can also comment on the open, and that you're part of the community that you're trying to attract into your project. After that, we typically see a round of people needing to improve documentation, because now the community of developers, the people working on that project, is a lot bigger than the people that work in the organization or the company. And so they find that documentation needs to get improved, and you find like process improvements that you need to make. And then finally, the very last point people get to, and some people never get to this point, is where they want to share ownership of a library, where they want to allow people who are not in the organization to actually co-maintain, help run the project that they work on. And if we look at the success of different open source projects, and I've pulled some examples of projects I've been personally involved with here, and what I've tried to do is match the number of new users of that project with how, when that project was created. We can sort of see different levels of success based on the different approaches taken. So if we say something like F#, where it wasn't as, it was a private fork, they weren't part of that community, that was built in a separate place and to what they followed. We see, pretty low levels of take-up. And then we see something like Node, which was always done in the community, like very, very, very high levels of take-up. And we see this, almost direct correlation. But if you notice here was a project I was involved in. It's called Roslyn. But you can see here, there's this massive jump in terms of people that are contributing into the project. And we see massive growth. So what actually caused that? And that was when we took the team, moved them from working on a private fork, publishing to open source, to actually working in the open source community. And at that point, just by doing that one thing, not changing anything else, not advertising the project anymore, not doing badges or any PR or anything like that, just by moving the team into the community and having them follow the same processes that everybody else followed, we saw a massive increase in the number of PRs accepted a month from the community. We saw a massive number of, community issues filing and loads more forks and things. So we saw much more community involvement once the development team moved into that community itself and became a core part of it. But I'll be honest, this doesn't come for free. When you're building in the open source, when you're getting used to doing product development in open source, it does come with some tensions, maintaining the direction of your project, how you do that and keep the community involved is an interesting thing that you need to learn. You need to learn how you give people a say while also controlling the scope of where you want your project to go. And so, we do things like have discussion forums, we post directions, and we give kind of, this is where we're thinking of heading, requests for comments, that sort of thing. And you need to understand the style and understand kind of how you want to maintain that direction. What you don't suddenly do is just go do what everybody wants you to do. You still have the backlog of what you want to deliver. And so maintaining that product direction is something you need to learn and something you need to build and develop. You also notice this distinct difference between people who are paid to work on the open source project and then people who are passionate contributors. Everybody has different deadlines. Everybody has different kind of working hours and things like that. And so those things can sometimes be at attention, especially if the salaried ones are the people needing to do the code reviews, needing to do them, review this code. There can be kind of frustration from your passionate contributors that it's taking so long for the people who are reviewing that code to get to it and all that sort of thing. And you need to think how you want to balance that, but you also need to set expectations appropriately with the community. That said, your salaried people are always going to be working on, what your backlog is in the order that you have. And there might be things that you want done that, are very expensive to go do, but are on your wish list of, where you want to go as a product. You just don't have time to get to them there. It's not the thing you're going to work on next as a small team. We very, very often find, as long as we make the product direction clear, that and we involve people in the community, and we make sure they know they can be a part of this community. These passionate contributors quite often go take the things that are lower down the backlog, the things that they can see the team are not going to get to anytime soon, go implement them themselves and go send them to you. And so you suddenly start getting, these contributions of amazing bits of IP and amazing things that you wish you could have gone and built. That's when they start coming in, and now you have to actually review them and things. So it's interesting. And then the final one is, and you've already got some experience of this over the past 12 months, but as you move towards shared source, both inner source and then open source, your teams always become more distributed. And so you have to learn how to work with a distributed team. And that means, more support for asynchronous work. That means, better documentation, better communication, especially written, but also recorded and video and things like that. So learning how to work with distributed team is, again, something that comes for free, but also comes with open product development. You have to learn how to do that, to build in the open as well. And remember, it is all about the community. John O'Bacon says in his book, People Powered, which is a great book I encourage you to go read, that people are, they're attracted to communities for the value, for that thing at the top of the contribution funnel. What value are they getting? But what keeps them coming back to a community, what keeps them attached to a community, is the intangible values of being part of that community. And you all know from communities that you're involved in, whether it's around school, whether it's around your local, area, it's the people you meet, the network connections you're making, the things you're learning from being part of that community that keeps you coming back. And so remember, you're going to attract people to the community based on what value you have, but the intangibles, the being part of that community, is what keeps them attached. And what you become as a developer in open source is you're part of this open source community, and you suddenly become part of a much wider community. But India is best placed in the world to completely excel when it comes to open source development and software development in general. We see a huge amount of contribution. We see a huge amount of interest, especially from younger developers in India, whenever we're doing anything that's related to technical development, whenever we're doing anything at all that's kind of, involved in software development. We see India already often exceeding the United States in terms of involvement. And that's massive. I live in the UK and we're like number 4, number 5 quite often in a lot of these things. So India's got a massive potential. It's got this massive community of people who are wanting to work together, who are wanting to collaborate, who are wanting to make India stronger. And as using open source, using communities, and using the network effects that communities bring, as long as you have your business goals, I'm hopeful that you can use that community and you can bring that community with you, and you can use them to, take India forwards as we go forwards to be the global superpower that it already is. So anyway, I want to thank you for listening to me. Thank you for your time. I'm just going to take some of the questions I've got here in Zoom, and then if that's how we're handling questions, I'll take them in the chat. So a question from Joesh was, what are the contributor agreements? Are they like open source licenses? And then what is free software, and is it the same as open source software? Great questions. So we'll take contributor agreements first. So if we go back, I'm just going to bring up my think about IP, like the flow of IP. When you make software available under an open source license, when you bring, what you're doing is now when somebody contributes to your project, you're bringing IP into that project. And typically a contributor agreement is or a CLA, a contributor license agreement, is people who are contributing to this project. You're making it very clear and very explicit the terms by which contributions are being made, and you're getting them to sign up for it as you do it. Different people do this in different ways. Some people think, and again, it depends what you want to do with that project later, or potentially what might happen with that project. So you'll see some large organizations having a CLA system, so contribution license agreement, where whenever anybody makes a contribution, they ask them to sign up and say that they agree to the contributor agreement. And that agreement typically has in it things that say, I'm giving you the copyright to this code. I, as an individual, have permission to give you the copyright to this code. I have the permission to give you, the IP contained within this code. And also accepting that, you might want to include something in your contribution license agreement that says, hey, I might want to relicense this code in the future under something which isn't the particular open source license. And so those things are contained sometimes within open source projects. And the sort of contribution agreement is basically, contributor agreement is by what rules are my contributions being treated, and being very explicit about it. If that's not provided, the general sort of understanding amongst sort of legal professionals and the general where it's been tested of very, very limited places, in my understanding, not being a lawyer, but been a very limited number of places where it's been tested. And what most lawyers kind of agree is kind of the baseline is that contributions are under the license that you were contributing to, kind of thing, is typically what happens. But lots of organizations like to be very explicit with that. So hopefully that answers that question. What is free software, and is it the same as open source software? Well, so there's two ways of interpreting free software as well. There's free as in, free as in a gift kind of thing. Free as in the open source organization in America, they talk about free as in beer, but I don't drink alcohol, so that's fine. But however you want to think about it. Or is it free as in speech? Or is it free as in, free of obligations and things? So if we talk about free software as in software that's available for free, software that you don't pay for, then that's not the same as open source, because it's not coming with a license. And then there's some people with some arguments around, open source licenses. And if an open source license doesn't give you the permission to take code that's been written with this license and then modify it, then is that really free? That's kind of like an ethical, moral debate. Personally, I like the MIT license and kind of those level of obligations, because that's the most open source in my view, because it's I'm basically giving you the minimal number of obligations on that license. It's don't sue me is the obligation I'm giving you, and maybe give me some attribution kind of thing. So again, that one's more of a kind of a discussion that can go on and on. Lots of different people have opinions on that, but free isn't free isn't the same as open quite often. And then again, so Sangeeta has the point about free as in floss, as in free and open source, and that's one interpretation of free software as well. But lots of people mean different things by that term, so it's important to kind of get into that, and it's an interesting kind of debate to have. As I can see, we're having the debate right now in the chat, so that's great. Right, I'm going to answer some more questions. Is Git sponsorship program rolled out in India yet? So we're talking about the GitHub sponsorship program. So that's GitHub sponsors. We're not talking too much about the different kind of vendor stuff in this chat. This is kind of vendor neutral here, but GitHub sponsorship program isn't rolled out yet, but the team are working strongly on it. What we do have running right now is a grants program that's available and that's actively running, where we've got a pool of money that we've made available, and we have a very sort of select panel of judges who are looking at those open source developers in India and actually awarding them, a significant amount of money to be able to develop open source and help contribute to the value of open source. So we're giving back there. But what we want to do is get to the point where we can enable the flow of money, and we can enable people to give money to other open source developers through our platform, and through other people's platforms as well. So that's kind of where we are. Great question. Okay. Super. Any other questions? I'm actually on time, and I know we've finished a little bit early because we're running earlier today, but hopefully that was useful.
Yeah, thank you so much, Martin. The session was actually very useful and engaging. Thank you so much for your time. Since it's a 2 days program, tomorrow also we have a second day session also. We will have other speakers from GitHub, and our internal team, open force team, will also be taking the sessions. So thank you so much. I would request Vinay sir to conclude today's session, and for the audience, meantime, when Vinay sir joins, we would mention that there's a WhatsApp group which has been already created. You can join that WhatsApp group, and the link that was shared today would be the same link for you to join the training. There would not be any separate link. In case you have any queries, please write on the WhatsApp group. So tomorrow morning, 10 a.m., we are going to start the session again, day 2. Thank you all for your time. We'll just wait for Vinay sir, our CEO, NEGD, to give the concluding remarks.
Ruchi, I just
Hello.
want to.
Yes,
yeah,
sir.
please come on.
Yes, sir.
Hey, somebody is asking some question, I think.
Okay, yeah. Anybody has any questions?
No question, I think.
Okay, somebody has mentioned about unable to join the WhatsApp link. You can please mention your mobile number in the chat section. We'll try to connect you in our WhatsApp group, or email address, whichever you're comfortable with.
Okay. Is the Mr. Martin still in? I have a question for him.
Mr. Martin, Dheeraj, Mr. Martin has left?
No, I'm here.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
How can I help?
Yeah, Martin, thanks for such a knowledgeable session. Actually, I wish to know that what is the revenue model of the open source communities like GitHub? How they able to generate money out of that? What's the basic revenue model beside that? Because that is a social.
Yeah. So is that the revenue model for communities on GitHub, or the revenue model for GitHub itself, or all of the above?
Yeah, for the both itself rather, because GitHub is a very popular, and so I was just exploring the things and couldn't find that GitHub has a lot of social contribution, but there needs to be revenue to sustain, right? So
yeah, indeed. So the way GitHub's revenue model is very, very simple. We make a set of features available, and we make them all available to the open source community broadly. So they're available for people to use on open source projects. And then we have some functionality that we make available to enterprises and that people who want to pay for extra features. So if you want to do free hosting, if you want to do share source code with your team, use the sort of the free things and for like startup levels, then we make that available to people for free. But where we make money and where we pay for all the open source hosting that we do is by making tooling available to enterprises and organizations that they can pay us for if they want extra features. So if you want to have, for example, single sign-on into your GitHub organization so that it hooks into Active Directory or Okta or something like that, then that's a feature that you don't need as an open source organization, but you do need as an enterprise. And so we'll make that available to enterprises, and then they pay to be on the enterprise plan. Other ones are around some of our security capabilities. We have tooling that's built in that helps you find vulnerabilities and helps you track open source vulnerabilities. We make all those available for free to open source projects because we want to make sure open source is secure, and we want to make sure that open source hosted on GitHub is the most secure open source that's available, and we can help secure the open source community. However, if you want to use those on your own private software, then we make those, then you have to pay GitHub for using those features on private source code. So not open source code, but on private source code. So that's kind of GitHub's revenue model. We don't do advertising. We don't sell information. It's purely about paying for access to additional features if you want to use them for private software development. Does that make sense for the GitHub side first?
Yeah, thanks for clarifying the things. Actually, it was in my mind since the Microsoft has acquired GitHub for such a lot of money. So
yeah, exactly. Why would they on earth would they spend all that money? There's other reasons why a company like Microsoft would do that as well. Why it makes sense for Microsoft to make the investment in GitHub. Microsoft are a massive software development company, and they increasingly have become an open source development company whose critical business model relies on being able to work with open source communities and build open source. And when you get to the size of Microsoft and you have, say, 110, 120,000 engineers, if those engineers can't do their job because features don't exist and because the platform they're working on doesn't have the investment it needs to support their engineers, then they can't do their work. They can't deliver software to people. And so for a company like Microsoft, like with all of Azure and with all those other software services they're trying to build and all that in Office and Windows and things, they can't build that software if GitHub isn't working. And so again, a company, large software companies would typically spend millions, if not billions, in their engineering infrastructure. And so it made sense again for Microsoft to make investments there because of how open source dependent it is now. As well as wanting to support, their core mission, their core value statement is to make people productive. So again, that made sense that aligned. Now, when it comes to the business value of communities on GitHub, there's lots of different business cases there. Everybody has different ones. Like if you've got like Chromium, where Google and Microsoft, in this example, are collaborating together on a browser engine with other people. What's the business value in them doing that? Well, that's around what I talked about around Agile and things. Like they have paid engineers working on this project. So their value is actually in being agile and having open collaboration and being able to show features early and get early collaboration on them and being able to work together. So even though they compete on the browser market with Edge and with Chrome and with operating systems as well, they're actually collaborating together as competitors on the Chromium open source project. Or say Linux is another fantastic example. The Linux open source project has Amazon, Google, Microsoft, DigitalOcean, and lots of everybody and lots of nation states and things all contributing to it because they're all wanting to be able to get value from it in their own internal infrastructure, and they're wanting performance changes, they're wanting a say on the direction, so they're contributing to that project. But they're all competing as well. And so that's what's this fascinating thing about open source not being a zero-sum game. Then you have other companies that do like a typical open source model is where you might give your software away for free. So you're maximizing your distribution channel because your revenue channel, your business is actually in support. And so maybe when we talked about the third column of why do this, distribution is the business case there. And so they are maximizing the distribution because they want to get people using their software, and they'll pay for support contracts and they'll pay for people to use it. So again, a company like Red Hat does a lot of that sort of stuff, is very, very successful there. But you get other companies as well with that kind of business model, even at a much smaller scale and down to the individual developers, or a team of two quite often are supported on that. And then it's critical for us as well as a company. The open source community is essential to us, and the success of that is essential to us. And so we are also trying to make sure that we make it easy for companies and for individuals to fund their open source dependencies to help. If you can't contribute code, if you can't contribute time to an open source dependency you have, but you want to make sure that open source dependency is sustainable and sticks around for the long term, and people are there to fix bugs and things like that. A great way of doing that is by being able to channel money to these open source projects to help them be funded and help pay for development. And so one of the questions was around, GitHub sponsors. That's one of the programs that we've had, but we're also working with other, funding providers to make sure we can build an economy where people that don't have the ability to pay for an entire developer to work on a project can pay, a few thousand rupees or whatever to pay for some development to that project to kind of chip in and enable this flow of value around to help people build other business models around open source. So we're trying to enable these more and more open source business models as we can.
I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So Martin, I am Ajoy from NGT team. So just in connection to your last question, discussion about the business model that can be built around the open source softwares. I have another question related to that only. When we come to government space, it's mostly about making benefits to the citizens, and we want to make the code open so that the government does not have to pay for the same kind of software again and again, because India is a federated big country where there are different states, just like US, and they may invest on the same software if the code is not open. So in coming to
that's collaboration, that's where compatibility and things, and that's where you have where you've got one state who's paid for the development, but it's paid for really out of the national coffers, and so paid by the citizens. So it makes sense to share that with a different state. You're not competing as states, you know what I mean, quite often in how you deliver services to your citizens, and so it makes sense to contribute and collaborate there for sure. I agree.
Yeah, exactly. So in connection to that, the licenses that you have talked about, my question is that you say that MIT licenses is the most non-restrictive or most permissive license agreement terms. But
it's one of the more permissive ones. There are more permissive, but it's very common. But anyway, carry on. Sorry.
Yeah, my question is that when we come to Kubernetes, which is a large community, or MongoDB kind of, so they have adopted Apache 2.0.
Yeah.
So I would like to know, when you look at from the government projects where our intention is to make the code public, and we don't run into any kind of legal obligations, and we have a platform where we can make our code open and invite the communities to participate. So which do you think in between Apache 2.0 and MIT, which one is the most preferred one in which kind of scenarios?
So I'll give you my reason as a business person, but you want to go speak to your lawyers as well. So if you're working with an existing community, it makes sense to use the license that's common in that community. Apache 2 is a very, very permissive license. It's a bit lengthier, but it's very permissive. It's a very well-known, it's a very well-accepted and a very well-proven license. Great license, perfectly good. And I've used that quite often as well. The only downside with Apache 2 is that, again, depending on different depending on different interpretations, and it's all up for debate, depending on which lawyer you go speak to. However, it's broadly agreed that if something's like Apache 2 isn't compatible with GPL licensed software, for example, and so if you have an Apache 2 license component, like linking that into and attaching that into GPL can be harder, can be problematic, whereas MIT licensed software is broadly compatible with GPL, which is another open source license. And so depending on the business reasons and the business reasons why you're contributing and contributing, you might want to go with a more permissive license that has broader applicability. It can be contributed to an Apache 2 project, as well as contributed to a GPL project, as well as contributed to a commercial project. But if you're just contributing code to a project that's Apache 2 licensed, stick with Apache 2. And so, as I say, that's why I'm like, there are lots of licenses and there are lots of really good reasons for picking them. And you want to kind of choose a license.com is a great site that'll kind of help guide you, that we make available. But my default answer, without knowing anything about you, is go for MIT because you're less likely to have problems, unless you've got a reason and you understand why you go pick a different one. So that's why I refer to that license. Apache 2 is fantastic. I love it. GPLv2 as well is a great license, and I've used it for a lot of other things as well. So, you know, and it's well proven and well known. So there are different times when you might want to pick different licenses. But yeah, MIT is the most compatible.
Okay, thank you very much.
No worries. Great question.
Yeah. Any other questions anyone has? Else,
hello.
Yeah, please.
I am Satyamani speaking from Ministry of Heavy Industries, looking after.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Actually, as per the government demand, we are having a language barrier.
Okay.
Because language barrier is more in this one. Already, Europe has developed a language barrier on European languages and global languages. Now it is a huge demand for that one, that is text in all languages as well as text to speech. That also to be built in a one single library. So how long it will help in open source, and if Martin can tell.
So is the question, can open source help us have improve our language barrier when it comes to kind of speech to things like that?
Speech as well as text, because the government is demanding all the website to be in all Indian languages such that it will reach the citizens very well.
Yeah.
And similarly, some people who are not having the infrastructure, they can easily get the voice such that they can easily understand it.
Yeah. I think, again, without digging into the problem space that much myself, I would need to look at it. But I would suspect that collaborating and adding support for different languages, different dialects, different accents into existing open source libraries around speech recognition and things is going to give you, usually gives you more benefits as an organization than trying to build your own thing standalone. Because now services that not just you provide in your organization, but services anybody provides are going to use those same things. And so the thing you're contributing back, the IP you're contributing, kind of benefits larger groups. The exact projects that you need to contribute to have that impact, though, I'm afraid I'm not an expert on. So I would need to do some research there. But yeah, it strikes me as an ideal place. Another place that's quite interesting as well is in training sets. So making available training sets for the machine. A lot of translation now is done by machine learning. And having a corpus available, having a set of text available, which allows private companies and different organizations to be able to train data easily on the different languages and on different dialects and on different, speech patterns and things, helps people build more accurate machine learning. And so we've seen, again, in this open data movement, which is very, very critical, especially when it comes to
global trade. What the thing is, last week when I attended an international conference with Russia and other Japanese, even Chinese. So Zoom is already started as some translator.
Yeah.
Because it's translating with the one language to another one. That the global demand is taught on VC conferences. Now the locally, this is going to be the future. Yeah. And this is also important in our Indian continent.
I completely agree.
It is open source because it will be easily achievable open source. And if you are working it up, it will not work for the Indian continent, even the global community, all the people with the NASA and all the things, we can do a very wonderful. We can reach the people who are not even an educated type of things, the citizens.
Yeah.
Okay, MIT will also, I have just put this request to MIT also. So letting you think, already I got this request from my minister as well as secretary. So then I put, and this open source will work, all the people do. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And again, it doesn't solve all your problems. I'm not promising that. It just helps you have more influence at a global stage as well.
Yeah.
Yes, I think it's about time now. And thank you so much. And thanks to the audience also. But before saying bye for today, as we have to connect tomorrow also, same time, 10 a.m. Before that, I would like Dr. Goyal to do the concluding remarks for today.
Yeah, Thank you. A very good afternoon to all of you. I request respected Secretary Sir to kindly allow to conclude the day one session with a brief vote of thanks. Sir.
Sir has left.
Okay. Okay. So we conclude the session with a brief vote of thanks. Respected Secretary Sir, respected President and CEO NEGD, and Chief Operating Officer, and our esteemed guest from GitHub, Madam Erika Besica, and Mr. Martin, and Dr. and Shri Devabrat Naik. On behalf of NEGD, I feel privileged to present